Hello, dear listeners of Sci-Fi Stories. Thank you so much for tuning in today with us. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with zero budget to keep our operations running. If you find today's story entertaining, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff for their daily living expenses and continue creating these sci-fi adventures for you. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment below. The reinforced classroom door slid open, and the vibrant, telepathic symphony of the room instantly died. Brent Bentley felt the chilling shift before he even opened his physical eyes, sensing a terrifying void where a living soul should rightfully be. Every cadet in the academy radiated a brilliant aura, a psychic signature of life energy, but the creature standing at the threshold emitted absolutely nothing, acting as a localized black hole in the shape of a fragile girl, silently devouring the ambient warmth of the entire room. Brent was deeply synchronized with the Academy's telepathic magnetic navigation grid, a state of deep meditation required for stellar cartography. Through his mind's eye, the classroom was a dazzling garden of light. He could feel the steady, pulsing crimson energy of the reptilian cadets, the soothing, rhythmic azure waves of his aquatic professor, and the sharp, geometric yellow static of the silicon-based exchange students. The neural network of the Space Naval Academy was always a chaotic, beautiful song of life. Beautiful. Then, the music stopped. The sudden absence of psychic resonance was so violently abrupt that Brent gasped, his secondary heart skipping a beat. He severed his neural connection to the navigation grid and snapped his four eyes open, turning toward the doorway. Professor Zylock floated at the front of the hall, his gelatinous tendrils gesturing toward the small, bipedal figure standing beside him. "Cadets, please direct your attention to the front and welcome our newest transfer student." The professor projected into their minds, though his psychic voice carried a strange tremor of unease. "She is a human, hailing from the Class 9 Deathworld known as Earth." Brent stared. The creature was astonishingly unimpressive. She was small, lacking the towering stature of a standard combat species. Her skin was a pale, soft beige, completely devoid of interlocking armored scales, thick thermal blubber, or the shimmering, metallic membranes required to deflect cosmic radiation. She looked impossibly fragile, a creature that a light breeze in a standard low-gravity corridor could snap in two. Her shoulders hunched slightly, and she clutched a physical, archaic paper notebook to her chest. To the physical eye, she was the absolute embodiment of harmless prey. But to the telepathic senses of the room, she was a terrifying anomaly. She cast no shadow in the psychic realm. Looking at her with the inner eye was like staring over the edge of a bottomless abyss. Brent narrowed his primary eyes, deciding to rely strictly on his biological vision. That was when he noticed the first glaring inconsistency. She was playing the part of a timid, overwhelmed herbivore perfectly. Her steps were small, and her head was lowered. Yet, beneath the curtain of her dark hair, her eyes were in rapid, calculated motion. She was not scanning the tiered seating for a friendly face or an empty desk. Her gaze snapped to the heavy structural pillars, identifying the tactical blind spots of the room. She traced the ceiling, locking onto the primary and secondary ventilation shafts. She evaluated the distance between the professor's podium and the emergency airlock. In the span of 3 seconds, this frail, unarmored girl had thoroughly mapped the structural weaknesses of the room, calculated multiple egress routes, and identified every potential choke point. A cold chill crawled up Brent's spinal ridge. She was not looking for a seat. She was establishing a kill zone. Before he could process this terrifying realization, a piercing, agonizing shriek tore through the classroom. It was the atmospheric breach alarm, a deafening sonic siren designed to penetrate the thickest cranial plating and alert crews to imminent explosive decompression. The reaction in the room was instantaneous chaos. The reptilian cadets hit the floor, curling into armored balls. The silicon-based students vibrated in agony, clutching their auditory receptors as the high-frequency sound waves disrupted their crystalline structures. Brent himself let out a hiss of pain, slamming his hands over his ear slits and shutting his eyes tightly against the blinding strobe lights of the emergency system. The room was drowning in a psychic tidal wave of pure panic and confusion. Through the overwhelming noise, Brent forced his primary eyes open just a fraction to look at the human. What he saw defied every known law of galactic biology. She had not cowered. She had not reached for her ears. While the rest of the Academy's elite predators and warriors writhed under the sensory assault, the human girl simply stood there. Her posture had subtly shifted, dropping her center of gravity. Her hands were no longer clutching the notebook. Her fingers were slightly splayed, relaxed but hovering near her waist. Brent watched in morbid fascination as her biology reacted to the perceived threat. Her pupils dilated massively, swallowing the color of her irises to flood her retinas with available light. The frantic rise and fall of her chest vanished, replaced by a terrifyingly slow, measured breathing pattern. Her muscles did not tense in fear. They relaxed, uncoiling like a highly compressed physical spring, entering a state of absolute, fluid readiness. She was not experiencing panic. Her body had seamlessly bypassed fear, injecting her bloodstream with a cocktail of chemical stimulants that shut down all non-essential functions to prioritize extreme violence and survival. Her organic mainframe was coldly calculating the optimal trajectory to stay alive, regardless of who or what stood in her way. Then, the siren abruptly cut off. "My apologies, class." Professor Xylock's mental voice projected, vibrating with embarrassment. A false alarm triggered by a malfunction in the lower sector grid. The alien cadets groaned, slowly uncoiling and nursing their ringing auditory organs. The psychic atmosphere was thick with residual terror and annoyance. But Brent remained frozen, his eyes locked on the human. As the strobe lights deactivated and the standard classroom illumination returned, the girl blinked. The terrifying, predatory void in her eyes vanished, instantly replaced by the wide, innocent gaze of a startled herbivore. She hunched her shoulders again, clutching her notebook tight. But right before she turned to walk up the aisle, her eyes met Brent's. She knew he had been watching her. She knew he had seen the truth beneath the skin. The human girl offered Brent a small, polite smile. It was a simple curvature of the lips, displaying blunt, white teeth. Yet, the moment that expression formed, Brent's dormant telepathic survival grid screamed in absolute, deafening horror. It was a primal warning from the deepest, oldest part of his genetic memory, flashing a single, undeniable truth across his consciousness. "Do not run, do not fight. You are already dead." The glow of the unauthorized data stream painted Brent's ocular ridges in a sickly green light. Sleep was a biological impossibility after the events in the lecture hall. Instead, he had retreated to his quarters, bypassed the Level 5 security protocols of the Academy's archives, and queried the Central Intelligence Matrix for a single planetary designation: Earth. The decryption took exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes, a delay that only deepened his dread. When the file finally rendered, Brent stared at the holographic projection in utter disbelief. The document was heavily sanitized. Entire blocks of elemental data were simply blacked out by Central Command. Information regarding the planet's gravitational pull was redacted. The average atmospheric pressure and the standard muscular output of the human species were completely expunged from the record. Roughly 99% of the basic physiological profiling had been erased by someone with military clearance. Only 2 categories remained uncensored, glowing starkly against the dark background. The first was radiation resistance. The parameters listed were so absurdly high that Brent initially assumed it was a transcription error. The data suggested that cellular structures from this death world could withstand cosmic bombardment that would instantly liquefy standard carbon-based life forms. The second visible category was neural architecture. The diagrams displayed a terrifyingly dense cluster of synapses, heavily weighted toward survival-oriented compartmentalization. The human brain was built to separate emotion from logic under extreme duress, effectively shutting down the sensation of terror to calculate the optimal path to continued existence. 48 hours later, the theoretical data morphed into a horrifying reality. The Advanced Orbital Tactics module required the cadets to interface with the central simulation hub. Each student was sealed inside an immersion pod, their neural pathways linked to a virtual dreadnought, navigating a simulated sector. The objective was simple: maintain structural integrity through a standard spatial magnetic storm. For the first 15 minutes, the exercise proceeded smoothly. Then, the central intelligence matrix malfunctioned, or perhaps a sadistic instructor deliberately overrode the parameters. The ambient warning lights in the physical chamber flared a blinding crimson. Warning: threat level elevated to limit red. Magnetic maelstrom category 9 detected. The automated voice droned, lacking any inflection. Inside the simulation, the virtual environment became a nightmare of tearing metal and cascading radiation. From his monitoring station, Brent could see the live neural readouts of every cadet in the grid. The alien minds broke almost immediately. The reptilian students' brainwaves spiked into chaotic, jagged peaks of pure terror. The aquatic cadets emitted psychic waves of suffocating panic, overwhelmed by the sensory input of impending virtual death. They began making catastrophic tactical errors. They redirected all power to forward shields, leaving their aft sections exposed to the shearing magnetic forces. They desperately fired thrusters, sending their dreadnoughts crashing into simulated debris fields. Their screens flashed red with critical failure notifications as they succumbed to the pressure. Brent dragged his gaze to the isolated monitor, displaying the human girl's neural feed. He braced himself for a chaotic tangle of desperate synapses. Instead, he saw a flat line of chilling tranquility as the virtual storm raged around her, tearing the digital hull of her ship apart. Her brainwave chart smoothed out into a perfect, rhythmic sine wave. The graph displayed 0 indicators of stress. There was no panic, no hesitation, and no erratic firing of neurons. Confronted with absolute annihilation, her mind had plunged into an icy, crystalline state of absolute focus. The closer she pushed to the precipice of virtual death, the sharper and colder her cognitive functions became. She was not trying to outrun the storm. She was dissecting it. Brent watched in morbid awe as she executed a survival strategy of breathtaking cruelty. A standard cadet would attempt to preserve the entire vessel to save the hypothetical crew. The human did not. With rapid, unflinching keystrokes, she deliberately deactivated the defensive grids on 3 outer decks. She manually vented the artificial atmosphere in the portside hangars, sacrificing roughly 40% of her virtual ship's mass, along with 3,000 virtual crew members, to the tearing magnetic winds. The alien instructors monitoring the session let out psychic gasps of confusion. But Brent saw the geometry of her violence. By feeding chunks of her own vessel to the anomaly, she altered the trajectory of the localized magnetic currents. She was using the debris of her own destroyed decks to build a temporary electromagnetic funnel. She did not flee from the natural disaster. She herded it. She manipulated the cascading energy waves, forcing the core of the storm into a spatial dead angle between 2 massive virtual asteroids. The tempest folded back on itself, its destructive energy cannibalizing its own momentum until it dissipated into nothing more than static interference. She had turned a Category 9 spatial anomaly into a trapped animal. She had made the storm her prey. When the simulation ended, the physical pods hissed open. The alien cadets stumbled out, vomiting translucent fluids and trembling uncontrollably from the phantom stress of the ordeal. The human girl stepped out of her pod a moment later. She smoothed down the fabric of her uniform, her shoulders curling inward. She lowered her head, adopting that same fragile, unassuming posture she had worn on her first day. She quietly apologized to an aquatic cadet when she accidentally brushed against his tentacle. Watching her, a profound realization anchored itself in Brent's mind. The shy, obedient schoolgirl persona was not a camouflage designed to trick them. It was not a disguise to hide among the weak. It was a biological leash. Her timid demeanor was a necessary restraint, an organic suppression mechanism keeping the patient, ruthlessly cruel predatory instinct of a Deathworld survivor tightly chained. She was walking on a razor's edge of lethal capability, simply waiting for the universe to give her a reason to let the monster off its leash. The botanical sector was intended to be a tranquil sanctuary for agricultural research. Brent and a squad of 14 cadets were conducting a standard atmospheric inspection near the primary hydroponic reactor core. The ambient lighting was a soothing emerald green, a stark contrast to the sterile metallic halls of the rest of the academy. Suddenly, a microfracture within the subatomic containment unit triggered a catastrophic pressure spike. There was no fiery explosion, no deafening roar of combustion to warn them. It was a completely silent, blinding flash of pure, hard ionizing radiation. A concussive wave of invisible kinetic energy slammed the entire group into the heavy steel bulkhead. The localized energy shields of the sector flickered erratically, groaned under the sudden, massive influx of raw nuclear power, and shattered like brittle glass within a fraction of a second. The automated warning sirens did not even have the necessary time to fully activate before the secondary containment seals failed entirely. A lethal, tidal wave of invisible, boiling death flooded the long corridor. For the fragile galactic species occupying the space, it was an immediate and gruesome execution. Brent collapsed heavily onto the grated floor, his lower appendages instantly losing all motor function. All around him, the highly evolved alien physiology began to violently unravel. The silicon-based exchange students let out high-pitched, harmonic shrieks as their delicate crystalline structures cracked and clouded over, turning to useless, opaque dust from the inside out. The reptilian cadets writhed uncontrollably on the deck, their interlocking armor scales sloughing off as their cellular cohesion completely dissolved under the relentless radioactive bombardment. Brent felt his own vision blurring rapidly. His internal organs were burning with a deep, agonizing fire as his genetic sequence was violently rewritten by the ambient gamma rays. His neuroreceptors screamed in protest as his blood literally began to boil. He was utterly paralyzed, his dual heart slowing down to a pathetic, stuttering crawl. He pressed his face against the cold, metal grating, simply waiting for the inevitable, merciful embrace of total organ failure. Then, through the glowing, highly ionized haze of the flooded corridor, a shadow moved. It was the human girl. While the elite, apex specimens of the galaxy were melting into pathetic puddles of genetic slurry on the floor, she simply placed her hands flat on the scorching deck and pushed herself upright. She stood completely steady in the dead center of the radioactive storm. The environment was so heavily saturated with lethal energy that the ambient air was ionizing into a bright, sickening blue corona around her silhouette. The standard issue hazmat suit she wore was designed for chemical spills, not a direct nuclear reactor breach. The synthetic outer fabric began to violently smolder, emitting thick, toxic black smoke before bursting into bright chemical flames. The melting polymers fused tightly with her inner uniform, creating a secondary, agonizing hazard of boiling plastic sticking directly to her flesh. She did not scream. She did not panic, and with a brutal, fluid motion of pure pragmatism, she dug her fingers into the burning collar and violently tore the suit apart. She ripped the molten hazard away from her torso and threw it aside, leaving her upper body completely exposed to the lethal environment. She stood wearing only a thin, scorched undergarment, her bare skin utterly defenseless against the highest concentration of raw radiation the Academy sensors had ever recorded. Brent forced his primary eyes to focus through the haze, fully expecting her fragile flesh to instantly liquefy and slide from her bones. What he witnessed instead fundamentally shattered his understanding of biological mortality. The human body was not quietly dying. It was fighting a terrifying, real-time war at the microscopic level. As the invisible radiation tore through her dermal layers, her skin aggressively reacted. A hyper-accelerated production of ultra-dense melanin flooded her epidermis in a matter of seconds. Her pale skin rapidly darkened into a profound, armor-like black hue, actively absorbing and violently dispersing the deadly ultraviolet and gamma wavelengths. But the radiation field was simply too strong. Blisters bubbled fiercely on her forearms, bursting open to reveal raw, bloody, pulsating muscle underneath. Yet, the destruction refused to spread before Brent's horrified and fascinated gaze. Hyperactive DNA repair proteins flooded the damaged zones in massive biological waves. It was a grotesque, mesmerizing cycle of extreme violence and raw, terrifying vitality. The flesh would boil, peel away, and instantly knit back together. Her human cells were dying by the millions every single second, and her terrifying Deathworld biology was actively regenerating them just as quickly. She was enduring a constant, endless state of agonizing molecular destruction and instantaneous biological rebirth. Her jaw was locked incredibly tight, the muscles in her neck straining as she narrowed her eyes against the blinding glare of the ruptured core. She stepped carefully over the convulsing bodies of her alien classmates and walked directly into the absolute epicenter of the breach. The localized heat and radiation near the ruptured coolant pipe were severe enough to vaporize standard industrial alloys. She reached out with her bare, blistering hands and firmly grabbed the manual emergency shutoff valve. The heavy metal wheel was glowing a dull, angry cherry red, the exact moment her palms made physical contact. The searing heat instantly incinerated her skin down to the raw white sinew. The sickening, heavy scent of burning human flesh immediately filled the enclosed corridor. But her relentless grip did not falter for even a microsecond. Her muscles, fueled by an endless, toxic cascade of adrenaline and regenerative proteins, locked firmly onto the wheel. She planted her heavy boots onto the floor and hauled backward with every single ounce of physical strength her dense frame possessed. The heavy, rusted mechanism groaned in violent protest. The exposed flesh on her hands was in a constant, horrifying state of melting away and rapidly rebuilding around the hot metal, a gruesome testament to the sheer, stubborn refusal of the human genome to perish. She drew in a ragged breath and gave one final, brutal heave. The heavy steel valve rotated. The primary locking mechanism finally engaged with a massive, echoing metallic clang. The blinding blue corona of deadly radiation abruptly died out, rapidly replaced by the loud hissing of emergency chemical coolant foam, violently flooding the destroyed chamber. 72 hours after the incident. The medical isolation ward was a symphony of agonizing life support machinery. Most of the squad remained submerged in heavy regenerative gel tanks, their fragile biologies slowly attempting to stitch themselves back together. Brent walked past their glowing pods, his own minor cellular damage having been purged by standard counter-radiation therapies. He stopped before the final containment cell at the end of the corridor. He expected to find the human girl comatose, perhaps permanently maimed by the brutal sacrifice she had made for them. Instead, the heavy blast doors slid open to reveal a scene of baffling domestic tranquility. She was sitting upright on the sterile medical cot, entirely disconnected from the intravenous nutrient lines. In her lap rested that same archaic paper notebook. She was quietly turning the pages. Brent stared at her hands. The deep, agonizing burns that had stripped her palms down to the white sinew were entirely gone. In their place remained only smooth, silvery lines of dense scar tissue, and even those marks were visibly fading into her natural skin tone as her hyperactive biology finished its aggressive cleanup protocol. She looked up, offering that same polite, blunt-toothed smile, though this time, Brent did not flinch. "You are awake," he projected with a gentle telepathic hum, stepping cautiously into the room. "And you are miraculously whole." She closed the notebook, tracing the worn cover with a healed thumb. "Humans heal fast," she replied softly, her vocal cords producing a raspy, acoustic vibration in the quiet air. "We have to, on Earth. Death does not just come from creatures with big teeth or sharp claws. The atmosphere we breathe slowly oxidizes our cells over decades. The water we drink is teeming with billions of microscopic predators. Our local star bombards us with heavy ultraviolet radiation every single day of our lives. We evolved on a rock that actively tries to kill us from the moment we draw our first breath. If we could not put ourselves back together quickly, we never would have survived our own planetary cradle." Brent sat on the edge of the diagnostic chair, tilting his head. "You are an apex predator," he observed, keeping his psychic projection carefully neutral. "Your physical parameters are terrifying. You can metabolize ambient poisons, ignore crushing pressure, and rebuild your own genetic code. Yet, you sacrificed your own flesh to save 14 herbivorous classmates you barely know. It completely defies galactic biological logic." The human girl looked down at her lap. For the first time since she arrived at the academy, the cold, calculating veil dropped. Her shoulders shook slightly. A single bead of saline fluid welled in the corner of her eye, spilling over her eyelashes and tracing a wet path down her cheek. "That is the great paradox of humanity," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We are built for absolute slaughter. We have the biology of a relentless terminator. But our neural architecture has this strange, irrational glitch embedded deep inside it. We possess this desperate, overwhelming genetic need to pack bond. We inherently crave connection. We instinctively want to protect the weak. We want to shelter the things that are smaller and more fragile than us." She wiped the tear away with the back of her hand, a gesture so profoundly vulnerable it made Brent's secondary heart ache. "Do you know how utterly lonely it is to carry a heart that desperately wants to love the universe, trapped inside a body that the entire galaxy perceives as a biological nightmare? Every single time I look at someone, their telepathic aura screams in absolute terror. I am a monster to everyone here, Brent, a monster who just wants to belong." The silence in the isolation cell was heavy, broken only by the hum of the ventilation scrubbers. Brent felt the ancient, instinctual warning systems deep within his reptilian brain, urging him to flee from the weeping apex predator. But for the very first time, he recognized that his biology was lying to him. True power was not the ability to endure nuclear fire or calculate a slaughter in milliseconds. True, terrifying power was having the absolute capacity for total destruction and actively choosing compassion instead. The kindness of a human was vastly more awe-inspiring and respectable than any weapon ever forged. Brent slowly reached out his scaled, four-fingered hand across the physical divide. He deliberately bypassed his fear, gently, laying his hand directly over hers. The moment his scales made contact with her warm, soft skin, a profound psychic barrier shattered. The localized black hole of her mind suddenly inverted. A brilliant, blindingly warm golden light flooded Brent's telepathic senses. It was a projection of pure, unfiltered empathy, grief, and desperate relief. He did not pull away. Instead, he anchored his own calm, steady psychic rhythm to her chaotic emotional storm, harmonizing their frequencies. The rigid boundary between the terrifying hunter and the trembling observer evaporated entirely, leaving behind two isolated souls anchoring each other in the dark. The fragile peace of the Academy was violently shattered precisely 3 weeks after the reactor incident. Brent was sitting in the central atrium, surrounded by dozens of other cadets enjoying a rare period of recreational downtime, when the heavy, reinforced bulkheads of the northern docking sector were blown entirely off their magnetic hinges. The concussive shockwave threw students across the room, shattering the decorative glass structures and plunging the sector into immediate emergency lighting. Marching confidently through the twisted, smoking wreckage came the Kalen. They were a notorious, galaxy-wide syndicate of heavily mechanized terror units. They were biological nightmares who had willingly carved away their own organic flesh to replace it with brutal, military-grade cybernetics. Their heavy metal boots slammed against the polished deck in perfect, terrifying unison. They did not shout demands or broadcast political manifestos. They did not negotiate. They moved with the cold, calculated, and utterly silent efficiency of an extermination squad designed solely to conquer. Before the Academy security forces could even draw their plasma rifles or establish a defensive perimeter, the Kalen deployed their primary weapon. Small, metallic spheres rolled smoothly across the floor, detonating instantly to release a thick, sickly violet gas that rapidly flooded the central ventilation matrix. It was a weaponized, highly classified neurotoxin specifically engineered to attack the universal nervous system architecture of all known spacefaring races. The effects were instantaneous and absolutely devastating. The moment the violet vapor touched his respiratory slits, Brent felt a horrifying, icy numbness crash through his nervous system. The synaptic bridges connecting his brain to his physical muscles simply evaporated. He collapsed hard onto the cold, grated floor, his limbs entirely paralyzed. All around him, hundreds of cadets, seasoned combat instructors, and heavily armed guards fell like severed puppets. Brent was completely trapped inside his own mind, his physical vision blurring into a static haze. His telepathic senses were reduced to a faint, muffled hum of collective terror. He could only watch in silent, immobile agony as the heavily armored boots of the Kalen Death Squad advanced unchallenged through the subdued room. Through the narrow slit of his remaining vision, Brent desperately searched the chaotic floor for the human girl. If any biological entity in this sector could withstand this chemical assault, it had to be her. Her radiation resistance was already the stuff of Academy legend. Her regenerative capabilities were godly. But as his eyes finally located her small, fragile form near the central fountain, his remaining spark of hope instantly died. She had collapsed in a heap on the floor alongside everyone else. Her eyes were tightly shut, her limbs sprawled in awkward, unnatural angles, and her chest was completely still. There was no microscopic battle fighting the toxin. There was no terrifying display of resilience. The deadly violet gas had seemingly done what nuclear fire could not. It had effortlessly extinguished the apex predator of Earth. A profound, crushing wave of despair washed over Brent's fading consciousness. They were completely doomed. The Kalen strike force confidently stomped right past her motionless body, their thermal sensors dismissing her entirely. They did not even bother to waste a plasma charge on a frail, clearly deceased human. The heavily armed squad aggressively secured the main control terminal, loudly declaring absolute lockdown of the entire orbital station over their internal radio frequencies. But the Kalen had made a fatal, universe-altering miscalculation. They had scoured the galaxy to engineer a neurotoxin that seamlessly disabled all known galactic life. But they had utterly failed to account for a species completely isolated from standard evolutionary trees. As the heavy footsteps of the terrorist leader moved toward the command deck, leaving the atrium cloaked in shadows and the hissing violet gas. The supposed corpse on the floor shifted, slowly, silently. The human girl opened her eyes in the dark. The lethal neurotoxin was actively flooding her lungs, completely saturating her bloodstream, and her alien biology was simply ignoring it. The galactic standard for neural transmission relied on a highly complex, copper-based enzyme chain that the gas easily disrupted. Human nervous systems, however, operated on primitive, brutal sodium and potassium ion channels, utilizing completely alien chemical transmitters like dopamine and serotonin. To her unique physiological architecture, the terrifying military-grade nerve gas paralyzing the entire academy was nothing more than slightly dense, foul-smelling air. She had not fallen because she was defeated by the chemical weapon. She had collapsed the very instant the threat registered in her mind, forcefully suppressing her own vital signs, slowing her heartbeat to a barely detectable crawl, and shallowing her breathing until it was entirely invisible to thermal sensors. It was a terrifying, deeply ingrained biological mechanism encoded into the oldest, most primitive layers of her brain. On her Deathworld, when facing an overwhelming, heavily armored predator that absolutely could not be fought conventionally in open combat, the ultimate survival strategy was to become uninteresting. It was the ancient, instinctual tactic of playing possum. She had deliberately allowed the Kaelin to dismiss her as a non-threat, waiting with cold, infinite patience for the heavily armed squad to expose their tactical blind spots. Instead of rising to her feet and engaging the armored cyborgs in useless physical combat that would inevitably end in her demise, she vanished. With a terrifying, fluid grace that made absolutely no sound against the metal floor, she slid silently toward the base of the nearest primary ventilation shaft. She bypassed the heavy security grate with a small metallic tool pulled rapidly from her pocket, folding her flexible body into the impossibly tight, dark, and winding metal corridor. The Kaelin controlled the open rooms, the hallways, and the command centers, but the human had just claimed the walls. From his paralyzed vantage point, Brent could barely hear the faint clicking of her movements, but what happened next sent a completely different kind of chill down his immobilized spine. Through his muffled telepathic connection, he felt a sudden, sharp spike of confusion from the supposedly emotionless cyborgs above him. The human did not strike physically. She initiated a campaign of absolute psychological warfare, using a salvaged piece of communication gear stripped seamlessly from a fallen security officer. She aggressively sliced into the heavily encrypted Kaelin internal tactical network. Suddenly, the harsh, metallic radio chatter of the cyborg terrorists echoing from the command deck was violently interrupted. A horrific, digitally distorted scream blasted through their localized earpieces, followed by the gruesome, highly detailed sound of tearing metal and crushed synthetic bone. The human girl, hiding deep within the pitch-black ventilation matrix, began perfectly mimicking the synthesized, monotone voices of the Kaelin soldiers. "Unit 4 is offline," a voice crackled over the open radio, perfectly matching the specific vocal signature of a terrorist stationed, guarding the lower engine bay. "There is something moving in the shadows. Do not proceed to Sector 7. Repeat. Do not proceed to Sector 7. Another voice instantly cut in, sounding uncharacteristically panicked and heavily distorted. "It is inside the armor plating. The structural integrity is failing rapidly, requesting immediate backup to the auxiliary maintenance corridor." The massive Kaelin leader roared in frustration, deploying 2 heavily armed assault units to aggressively investigate the source of the distress calls. Brent listened intently as the heavy metal boots stomped away into the distance, followed exactly 4 minutes later by a sudden, sickening silence over the communication channel. The units did not report back. They simply ceased to exist on the network. Then, the human broadcasted a new sound over the open frequency. It was not a mimicked voice or a faked scream. It was a low, incredibly slow, rhythmic tapping against a hollow metal pipe, echoing perfectly from every single ventilation grate in the entire facility simultaneously. It was the sound of a relentless hunter gently tapping on the glass of a locked cage. The heavily mechanized, fundamentally emotionless terrorists began to aim their heavy plasma rifles frantically at the ceiling, their unshakable combat programming violently cracking under the crushing weight of an unseen, incomprehensible threat. The fragile, timid schoolgirl mask was entirely gone. The apex predator of Earth had officially turned the captured academy into her own personal hunting ground. The orbital academy ceased to be an educational facility. It became a terrifying testament to Earth's oldest, most brutal hunting strategy: pursuit predation. The human did not rely on overwhelming physical force. She relied on absolute, inescapable endurance. While the cybernetic Kalen required constant, localized charging and strictly regulated thermal cycling, the human body simply pushed through the exhaustion, burning her stored kinetic energy with terrifying efficiency. She did not just hide, she actively herded them, using stripped copper wires and modified energy cells scavenged from the maintenance shafts. She laid localized electromagnetic traps throughout the darkened hallways. One by one, the heavy assault units were systematically funneled into the upper atmospheric processing sectors. There, she severed the artificial gravity plating, floating blindly in the pitch-black, zero-gravity environment. The massive metallic frames of the terrorists became clumsy and entirely unmanageable. The human, however, moved like a native phantom in the weightless air, using the bulkheads to launch herself silently from the shadows. The Kalen never even saw the creature dismantling them. Their visual feeds simply cut to static before their communication lines went permanently dead. Their unshakable mechanical pride utterly shattered under the crushing weight of an invisible, relentless psychological terror. The Kalen warlord, a towering behemoth of scarred synthetic tissue and heavy plasma cannons, completely lost his nerve. He abandoned his surviving units to the dark and frantically retreated to the central command vault. He slammed his heavy, armored fist onto the lockdown panel, forcefully engaging the heavy magnetic alloy deadbolts. The door was a masterpiece of galactic engineering, designed specifically to withstand a direct, sustained strike from a Class 4 orbital laser. Inside the heavily shielded room, the warlord slumped heavily against the main console, his synthetic respiratory pumps heaving in absolute, unprecedented panic. He was completely sealed off from the rest of the station, confident in his impenetrable fortress. From his paralyzed position in the distant atrium, Brent's fading telepathic consciousness drifted through the station network, locking onto the faint, rhythmic pulse of the human. He watched through his mind's eye as she calmly approached the massive vault door. She carried no heavy explosives or thermal plasma cutters. Instead, she raised a jagged piece of rusted scrap metal and deliberately dragged it across the palm of her own hand. The warlord watched the external security feed in utter, paralyzed confusion as the girl pressed her bleeding hand directly into the exposed primary circuitry matrix of the locking mechanism. The Kalen failed to understand the absolute hostility of Earth biology. They did not comprehend that the human bloodstream was a chaotic, thriving soup of symbiotic extremophiles, the microscopic, iron-oxidizing bacteria native to her world. Perfectly harmless to her organic tissue, violently reacted to the highly advanced alien synthetic compounds. The metal-eating microbes aggressively multiplied in the localized oxygen-rich atmosphere, gorging themselves relentlessly on the delicate, highly complex circuitry. Within exactly 45 seconds, the unbreakable magnetic lock fizzled violently, dissolved into absolute, smoking slag, and loudly disengaged. The heavy vault doors slid open with a sickening, defeated grind. When the heavy cruisers of the Galactic Federation Rescue Fleet finally breached the station's main airlocks exactly 20 minutes later, heavily armed alien commandos aggressively swarmed the command deck. They immediately stopped dead in their tracks, entirely stunned by the impossible tableau laid out before them. The most ruthless, terrifying terrorist warlord in the entire sector was tightly curled into a pathetic, trembling ball in the corner of the room, loudly weeping and desperately begging for his life. Standing directly over him was the frail, unarmored human girl. Her standard academy uniform was torn and heavily stained with dark, synthetic fluids. In her right hand, she loosely gripped a heavily rusted metal pipe, the blunt end hovering just an inch above the warlord's fragile cranial plating. The tension in the room was absolute. Then, the human took a slow, incredibly deep breath. The terrifying, calculating void in her dark eyes suddenly vanished, rapidly filling with a soft, gentle warmth. She deliberately unclenched her fist. The heavy metal pipe clattered loudly onto the deck. She chose not to execute the broken terrorist. She actively swallowed the lethal, predatory instincts of her Deathworld, meticulously tucking the terrifying monster back behind a polite, unassuming mask. She simply turned her back on the most dangerous threat in the room, effectively dismissing him entirely to the authorities. She calmly walked out of the vault, navigating her way back to the central atrium. She stepped lightly over the paralyzed bodies of the Kalen squad until she finally reached Brent. She knelt quietly beside him. Reaching up, she casually wiped a thick streak of black machine oil from her cheek with the back of her hand. She picked up her battered paper notebook from the floor, dusted off the cover, and looked down at his immobilized form. She offered him that same familiar, blunt-toothed smile. "Do you want to continue our study group?" she asked lightly, her raspy voice carrying absolutely no trace of the horrific violence she had just orchestrated. Brent could not physically move his face, but within the psychic realm, he projected a massive, radiant wave of profound relief and genuine affection toward her. He finally understood the greatest truth of the universe. The absolute miracle of humanity was not that they wore the terrifying skin of an apex predator. The true miracle was that the most devastatingly dangerous creatures in the entire cosmos possessed the supreme, uncontested power to annihilate their enemies. Yet they actively chose gentleness, mercy, and profound compassion simply to protect their friends. As the medical teams rushed into the atrium to administer the chemical antidotes, Brent knew the Academy, and perhaps the entire galaxy, had just entered a magnificent brand new era. Hello once again, dear listeners. Thank you so profoundly for staying with us until the very end of today's journey. We would love to know exactly where you are tuning in from today. So please let us know your city or country in the comments section below. If you truly enjoyed this story and want to help us keep the lights on during these difficult times, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. Your incredible kindness allows us to pay our dedicated staff so they have enough money to support their families and keep bringing these amazing sci-fi universes to life for you every single week. You can easily make a contribution by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the donation link provided in the video description and pinned comment. Thank you so much for your incredible support, and we will see you in the next adventure.